welcome to CrossView Radio podcast for Wayne County. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church in Orville. We exist to glorify God by exalting Christ and magnifying the gospel for the joy of all nations. There's an episode of the sitcom Frasier, which I've never watched, by the way, where the main character, Frasier, hosts a radio program as a psychiatrist. In one episode, Frasier is sick, and his brother fills in for him on the radio program. His brother Niles begins the episode this way. "This is Dr. Niles Crane, filling in for my ailing brother, Dr. Frasier Crane. Although I feel perfectly qualified to fill Frasier's radio shoes, I should warn you that while Frasier is a Freudian, I am a Jungian, so there'll be no blaming mother today." One's diagnosis of a psychological problem is always contingent upon one's pre-commitments. Are you a Freudian or a Jungian? But, of course, those are not the only two options available to us. If one adheres to the behavioristic school of thought after John Watson and B.F. Skinner, one would have the tendency to think of the problems in terms of bad teaching or a bad environment. One must therefore solve the problem by putting the person in a good environment. If one adheres to the humanistic school of thought after Carl Rogers, one would tend to think of the problem in terms of unmet needs. The goal of counseling then would be to encourage self-esteem, self-love, and self-actualization. If one adheres to the materialistic school of thought beginning in the 1960s, one would tend to think of the problem in terms of a chemical imbalance in the brain. The goal would then be biological homeostasis by the use of psychotropic medication. I've made this point before on the podcast that there is no uniformly accepted psychology today. And the same is true for the specific topic of today, which is trauma. Today will be the first of several episodes on the topic of trauma. And it remains true that yesterday's assumptions are quickly overwritten to keep up with the ever-evolving, most up-to-date findings of quote-unquote science. Case in point, The Body Keeps the Score is a #1 New York Times bestseller. I read this book, and if one thing is clear, it is that everything you ever assumed about trauma is wrong. But a year from now, there will be another bestseller, and then another, and then another. Is there anywhere we can go to find an unchanging, stable understanding of trauma and the afflictions that plague us as humans? Of course, I believe there is, and I believe that if you are struggling through trauma, that there is hope. Instead of waiting until the end of this series, I'm going to spoil it to you now and tell you that Thomas Boston's The Crook in the Lot is a much better and biblically rich answer to trauma. Way better, of course, than The Body Keeps the Score, which will be outdated before you could blink. Okay, so where do we begin? Well, as any responsible student would do, we will begin our study here with defining our terms. We will start with some secular definitions. The American Psychiatric Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. According to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, trauma is an emotional or physical response to one or more physically harmful or life-threatening events or circumstances with lasting adverse effects on your mental and physical well-being. The DSM-5 is a little broader in their definition and admits that there are many variations. They say psychological distress following exposure to a traumatic or stressful event is quite variable. It's a little bit like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall in one sense. What I mean is that you can't have the precision of diagnosing someone like you might have the precision of diagnosing a torn ACL. One of the themes that you'll see come up again and again in these definitions is that trauma is a response. Trauma is simply then, I would say, the human response to suffering. That response will vary from person to person and situation to situation. One Christian author defines it this way. He says the word trauma refers to the emotional, spiritual, and physical disruptions that occur when a person is overwhelmed by extreme suffering. Another Christian author says post-traumatic stress is a whole person response to traumatic events that encompasses the physical, mental, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual being of those affected. The Bible, of course, also addresses this issue. No, you won't find the word trauma in the Bible, as that has become a very specialized term, but you will find plenty of synonyms. Some of the synonyms are affliction, adversity, calamity, catastrophe, tragedy, deep affliction, and heavy affliction. And of course, you see the effects of trauma on multiple Bible characters. There are stories of abuse, rape, murder, betrayal, torture, and persecution. Does the Bible then give us a way to understand our trauma and a path forward? I say yes. We don't need the findings of modern psychology, as diverse as these findings are, to find hope. We can simply look at Scripture, and this is, of course, the plan that we have for this series. The other problem we face here as we come to this topic is that the diagnosis is uncertain. First of all, the worldly or secular understanding of what qualifies as trauma and PTSD has changed over the years. Alan Francis, the chair of the DSM-4 and author of Saving Normal, not a Christian to my knowledge at all, writes this. He says, almost everyone has at least some intrusive imagery and emotional reactivity to cues after a shocking event. This is part of the human condition, until recently was not defined as illness. For most people, the intrusive images gradually became less intrusive and the triggers became less terrifying. The mental disorder, PTSD, should be diagnosed only when the symptoms persist and cause significant disability. He isn't writing as a Christian, but even he understands that we've become too lax with our diagnostic standards. He then writes this, but then things get difficult. The diagnosis of PTSD is imprecise because it is based exclusively on the person's own self-report. There is no laboratory test or objective measure. It is inherently difficult for people to accurately report their reactions to an overwhelmingly terrible event. Many and complex psychological and contextual factors may lead them, consciously or unconsciously, to downplay or to exaggerate their symptoms. It is no surprise that rates of PTSD in returning veterans can vary so dramatically, just a few percent to as high as 20%, depending on how the diagnosis is made and which country is surveyed, even if the troops have had similar wartime experiences. Since there is, of course, no laboratory test, we depend 100% on a person's self-perception of their present condition. This is, in all honesty, extremely problematic, since we can't tell if a person is exaggerating their experience or downplaying their experience. Added onto this problem is a reality that you are not allowed to question a person's self-report. That's a big no-no today. And so much of today's therapy is simply self-affirmation. If someone comes to you and describes their trauma, you really only have one option, and that is to affirm that, at least according to the elites today. If you are still seeing a therapist, by the way, if you're being counseled and you're still seeing a therapist after a year, my question is simply this: what are you doing? They're supposed to help you get better. Maybe you need someone to come in and start questioning some things. It has to be acknowledged that almost everyone has trauma today, quote unquote. Again, in his book Saving Normal, Alan Francis coins the term diagnostic inflation to describe the tendency to make everything, even normal human behavior, a psychological diagnosis. In other words, depression and anxiety no longer apply only to the abnormal responses, but normal sorrow and normal worry are now clinical. The point I have to make here is that diagnosing everyone with trauma is unfair to those who are genuinely suffering. And our society has done that, which is a disservice to the people who really and genuinely need help. In any event, we note here that there is no certain diagnosis or diagnostic criteria other than the subjective markers that are self-reported, not observed. Because of this, there is one important caveat that I have to share with you at the beginning of this series. This issue is one that concerns the present cultural moment that we find ourselves in here in early 2026. As difficult as it is to understand why this is the case, nevertheless, it is the case that many people today want to be victims and want to have trauma. And so here's the problem that I face. In a podcast like this, there are some people who are going to listen who truly need help and have truly faced hard circumstances. And there are others who have exaggerated their experiences. I would say that there are probably 4 different groups of people who are going to be listening to this. Group number 1 is those people who are hurt and responding poorly. Those people need both rebuke and encouragement. They need the encouragement for their hurt, but they also need some rebuke for how they're responding poorly. Group number 2 would be those who are hurt and responding well. Those people simply need encouragement. Group number 3 would be those who are listening to this and are not hurt, but they're responding poorly anyway. And those people need rebuke and not encouragement. And then group number 4 would be those who are not hurt and those who are responding well, and those people simply need to be equipped to help others. Group number 1 is those who have faced legitimate hurt, legitimate pain, legitimate suffering, but they're not responding well to that. Maybe they've become bitter and resentful. Maybe they've not forgiven the person who hurt them. Maybe they're not trusting God. Maybe they are deconstructing. The second group of people is those who face legitimate hurt and they're responding very well. This person needs encouragement, help, and people to cheer them on. As Richard Sibbs said, misery should be a lodestone of mercy, not a footstool for pride to trample on. We need to be merciful to these people who are in misery. The third group would be those who have not experienced real hurt, and they are responding poorly anyway, as if they had experienced hurt. If you have trauma because your boss told you to come into work when you had a cold one time, or because your Starbucks barista gave you whole milk instead of almond milk, or because you're having trouble adulting, then you need rebuke and not encouragement. My 6-year-old can handle life better than you. And the fourth and final group is those who have not been hurt and who are handling life well. They need equipped to help those who are in either group 1, 2, or 3. And so the goal is to weave all of these kind of in and out throughout this series. And I look forward to diving into this in more detail together in the weeks ahead. Thanks for listening to CrossView Radio. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church in Orville. We meet Sundays at 9 a.m. To find out more about CrossView Church, visit us online at crossvieworville.com.